Firewalls, IDSs, IPSs, antivirus, all this stuff is great and does help us with security, but it doesn't do a whole lot of good if you just leave it to where anybody can go grab it. So we're going to be talking about physical security in today's episode.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus here at IT Pro TV, and today we're going to get a little physical, right? We're going to talk about how do we keep the devices that we have secure, not in maybe a digital way, but to keep people like me or Wes from just walking over and going, "This is nice," and going home with it, because that is something you do have to worry about in any case. Well, Wes, you're going to show us some of the things that we can implement today to help secure those things down. Where do we start?
Most definitely. You know, when we talk about physical security, you're going to hear the term probably other edutainers. I know we've said things like guards, gates, and guns, and that's really what some of the concepts, maybe not in the guns here, but we are going to talk about guards and gates. And when it comes to physical security, it's like Dan said, how do we secure those devices that a lot of times in IT, we just think about the logical, the software side, the device itself, but we got to make sure things like our data centers, things like our perimeter, if you will, physical perimeter, are secure. So let's go ahead and let's some of these things you're probably going to be aware of for the exam already, but if you're not, hopefully we can help you out with them. So let's talk about the very first thing coming up, bollards, barricades, and fencing. You guys and gals out there, I'm pretty sure know what these are, right? We talk about physically blocking access into the building. And if you've ever been to, something like Washington, D.C., I remember going there, and we had here at IT Pro TV, we had some kind of convention that we were going there. And one of the guys that works here in IT Pro TV, he deals heavily with the military. And he actually, as we were walking around, said you could see this building and look how this building's architecture, right? Notice how it's raised up. Notice how they got these how do you say that? The bollards around there, right? And then things like raised concrete, barricades, if you will, and even as far as things like steel that would raise up and it would withstand the impact of like a locomotive, like a train, a diesel engine coming at it full speed. It could withstand that, right? So this is really the first line of defense when we talk about physical defense within your buildings, those fencing, if you will, as well as barricades as likewise.
All right, starting from the outside, working
right.
our way in, right? That's where we want to start. We want to make sure that if somebody is going to try to gain access unauthorized to your stuff, well, they're going to have a long road to hoe. It's going to have a couple of things, fences literally, that they'll have to jump over and traverse before they can actually put their hands on equipment and walk off with it or gain data access. There, let's move on to one really cool idea of I love the name of it. It's a man trap, right?
Sure.
Man traps are cool. You've probably dealt with one before. I know I have, but I didn't know that's what it was called until I started getting into secure. I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Tell us a little bit about a man trap.
Well, sure. I was thinking this is like something like from Mission Impossible, right? And well, if you've ever gone into a place like a bank, you've probably already seen a man trap. And again, like Dan said, rightfully pointing out that you probably didn't know that it was called that. In the basic form of a man trap would be like a turnstile, right? If you've ever had to go international travels and you had to pull out your passport, right? The turnstile allows you through it, or if you're in the subway and it locks you in place while the person authenticates in front of you, and then they go through and then it lets you through there so that you can authenticate. Remember, we want one authentication. We want one secure access. We don't want piggyback attacks. So let me show you what a man trap is on a larger scale. Again, you've probably seen these before, right? It is typically the kind of like that midway point between public access and a secure access location, right? Now, this is just a basic one that you see in banks. They can get very, very, I would say, highly technical, if you will, to where you've got two secure doors. You've got one that allows you to authenticate to get into the man trap, and then it has to close. And then to get into the next location, the secure access beyond that, you authenticate again, you go into that door closes, and now somebody behind you, authorized user, of course, can make their way in, but it helps to prevent what we know as tailgating or piggyback attacks.
I actually dealt with one of these at a zoo before, right? Because they allowed you to kind of like wander with the animals in one certain area. I think it was kangaroos. But the kangaroos, if you just had one door and you open the door and try to walk out, they'd come up behind you and they would go waltzing around the zoo. So they built a man trap.
Sure.
You have to go in, close the door, and then you could open the other door and get into the rest where the petting area was. And it was actually really neat. But that's it's a basic mantra. I mean, it wasn't nothing special. It didn't have the highly technical, sophisticated technologies that we have in like things like a bank, but very simple idea, but very effective at keeping people out of and keeping equipment and other things from leaving a secured area. So really cool stuff. And of course, if anything like this does end up happening, well, you got to let somebody know about it. And that's the
right.
alarms, right?
Yep, definitely. That's another aspect of physical security. We talk about just some kind of alarm system. I know that we've got one here at IT Pro TV. I'm sure that in your building, maybe at work, you've got one. If you probably live in some kind of maybe complex that might have an alarm system on it. Maybe it's your home, right? Concepts are all the same. All right, some kind of way that we can alert, like Dan said, alert somebody to the fact that maybe there's been some kind of unauthorized access. And that's really where just things as simple as alarms come into play. Now, we could couple that with guards too, because you don't want to just stop with one type of security control, right? You want compensating security controls where we have an alarm. Well, that's great. And now the alarm's going off, but the problem is we need somebody there to respond to the alarm. Now you might have somebody on site, or you might have a third-party monitoring system that allows you, that maybe alerts law enforcement, maybe EMTs if that happens. But alarms, and again, it's just a way that you can alert somebody, alert the company, if you will, to unauthorized access.
If an alarm goes off in a building and no one's there to hear it, is a theft still occurring? I don't know. Let's say questions for us to answer. Let's keep moving on. I like this idea because it kind of goes all the way from the outside, from your fences into your doors, and even inside of your facility. It's the idea of signs, letting people know what is authorized, what is unauthorized, and maybe even what the consequences may be if you move beyond where you're supposed to be.
Most definitely. You've probably seen one of these signs before if you've ever been in a building where there's secure access required, right? No entry, authorized personnel only. And again, just making you aware that if you are not the authorized user, you shouldn't be going on beyond this point. So it's not one of those things that somebody could say, well, we really didn't know. We didn't have any warning that we weren't supposed to be in that location. If you have signage up there, it makes it very clear that somebody that isn't authorized should either contact somebody who's authorized to gain access, or at the very least should be an authorized user.
Yeah. And now that you know where you are supposed to be and aren't supposed to be, you got no excuse when the man comes by and says, guess what? You're in the bad place. You're not supposed to be here. We have a problem, right? But that's not the only way in which they might notice something. A guard could see you there, but probably the way in which they did recognize you or saw you, that you had moved into an area you shouldn't be, is probably through some sort of CCTV, network cameras, things of that nature, where you're watching, you get a much better perspective of the entirety of your physical grounds, right, Wes?
Yeah, cameras are very important, and when we talk about closed caption television, they have entire systems that allow you to monitor via video on location and on prem. Now, you could have just cameras that allow, again, a third party. Remember, CCTV is going to be, a lot of times, is going to be somebody coupled with a guard that's on site and potentially watching different locations, a lot of public areas, as well as some of those secure locations, too. Be aware of the different types of cameras that are out there that they just kind of call out on the exam. Motion recognition. And I'll tell you, in fact, some of the ones that I've seen, even some of the really cool ones that I went out to Sam's Club the other day, they, believe it or not, they sell these type of CCTV systems, and they had both of these built in. Right, where to save a little bit of power, they're maybe in a lower powered state come on when there's object detection or some kind of motion recognition. But keep in mind that there are a couple of different types that we need to be aware of for the exam. And that's really it, just the difference between a motion and an object detection, and it should be kind of obvious what they do. Again, motion is going to require movement of some type. Object recognition is just the fact that it can detect that something's in that camera and pan right to it and maybe even zoom in on it a little bit more. You might have seen this too, where sometimes they're static and they don't move, and all you see is people passing by. But there's other times if a point of interest comes into the view of the camera, that it actually kind of pans down and focuses in on that type of, whatever's on the screen. So very basic, but just be aware of them for the exam.
All right. Well, so far I think there's nothing beyond the grasp of anybody that's watching. And not that this next idea would be either, but probably not something you would think of off the top of your head when it comes to physical security. And that's the idea of using a Faraday cage What are we using Faraday cages for?
Yeah, so a Faraday cage, what it does is it blocks electromagnetic interference. All right, you can see these as little as something that maybe you've seen the wallets where for people that are wearing tinfoil hats, right? You put you put your wallet in there, right, and you can't have somebody just casually doing things like card reading, if you will. And the other ones that we have, actually, you could put entire servers in there. They have a corporate enterprise level building shielding too, where it doesn't allow electromagnetic interference coming in, and it doesn't allow that electromagnetic emanation, if you will, outside. Because believe it or not, even though they're highly sophisticated attacks, there is the ability to kind of know what you're doing based on electromagnetic, just what you say, emanations, if you will, outbound. But also keep in mind that any type of electromagnetic interference could also corrupt information as well, and that's certainly not something we want, especially when we talk. You remember one of the things we talked about are threat actors, right? One of those threat actors could be competitors as well too. So just know that the Faraday cage, it prevents electromagnetic energy from radiating out of whether it's a server, whether it's a network device, or sometimes it's as large as an entire building or room.
Yeah, I think of those Tempest attacks where they're able to actually read the electronic emanations from like a monitor and recreate it on a different monitor, so they can see through walls, through bricks, because they're just grabbing that emanation out from the clear blue sky, as it were, and recreating it right there on a different screen. So very interesting attacks. Faraday cages could help you out with that. Let's move on to USB data blockers. Man, everybody likes USB data blockers, right? Because I could go stick the USB stick in and grab some data and abscond with it, right?
Yeah, and these, again, these are also, keep in mind, in the context of physical security, because we could talk about a logical USB data blocker such as a group policy that says, hey, I'm going to close that port down. You're not going to be able to transfer any information on whatever your workstation is. But at this point, what we're talking about are physical devices that could be plugged into the ports of machines that don't allow that information to be transferred. Now, I didn't put in the inside here. I want to go ahead and, while we're talking about USB data blockers, I also want to talk about protected cable distribution too. You also have things like wall jacks that somebody could just plug into and potentially have access to your network. So even though it's not on the list, it is part of a physical security. So I do want to kind of mention it here. Just keep in mind, anytime you have open ports or wall jacks within your networks, those could potentially be ports of entry. And while you have other things within your switches that you can do, like things like port security, so making sure that even if they do plug in, the switch isn't going to allow them to communicate. But remember, at the physical level, you can also stop that just by having those basically port covers that block anybody from plugging down into your network.
Well, there you go. I liked Adam's, where he just had it filled with crazy glue, and then you couldn't plug in a USB key. That will stop you. But let's move on. Now, you've kind of hinted at this. We touched on this just a bit here when we talked about the camera idea, right? You said that some of them would be able to lock in on things of interest. And they do that using sensors, right? Either a motion or heat, or there's a bunch of different sensors. What are the sensors we need to be aware of for the exam?
Sure. Well, one of the first ones is a real basic one. You've probably seen these on the wall and maybe didn't know what these were. If you've ever seen one of these on the wall, well, that's a motion detector. And I know that we have these in this building, but we also have in a building that I used to work with as a training company. It was kind of interesting. One night it was actually set off by a big duck flying right into an office window and shattering it, and it triggered the security alarm. Now that's a little bit excessive there, so it'll make you aware of avian, how would you say that? Avian
attacks,
intruders or something like that.
I see Wes rolling out in his underoos.
That's right. So motion detectors are some that we need to be aware of, but there's also, noise detectors, and again, detecting certain amounts of decibels, if you will. You can see these also in data centers. Now, I will tell you that something that's not in this list that kind of seems kind of like a mission impossible is there's also pressure sensors that can be within the floors when you have raised flooring, if you will, in certain highly secure data centers. Again, just putting pressure down on that floor triggers a sensor and lets people know. It's not in there, but in combination with this as well, I would definitely be aware of it. Here's an example of one as well. This is not really a commercial model, something more that you would buy for your home. Also, we have to worry about things like climate control. So for instance, moisture detectors. That's important because remember, you do need a certain level of humidity within your data centers, but too much will lead to condensation. It can lead to short circuiting. If we don't have enough moisture or any moisture, that could be electrostatic discharge, which can ruin your circuitry. So you definitely need some kind of climate control system, if you will. And not only moisture detectors, you also need temperature monitoring too. Remember that with temperature monitoring, it's important to make sure that you have a good climate control system inside of your data centers. And the same thing with proximity readers too. Now the proximity readers, these could be things like key fobs. We'll see it when we talk about locks coming up, where you've got a key fob and you get it close to the sensor and it reads it. Smart card, if you're doing smart card authentication, these could also be them, but they put them in here under sensors. So just be aware of these 5 different types for your exam when they ask you about physical security.
All right, that makes sense. Good stuff there. Now, no physical security conversation would be complete, and we would be remiss if we did not add the idea of utilizing locks, right? Locks are the thing that we're probably all most familiar with. There's a few different types that we could utilize to keep our data secure, right, Wes?
Yeah, and I guess it just depends, like we've talked before, Dan, how much money do you have to throw at your security, right? So I could start with some of the more expensive ones, right, for biometrics. And remember, we have an episode on biometrics and the different types of biometrics. So just reminding you, it could be voice recognition, fingerprint scanner, could be some kind of facial recognition system, maybe an iris or a retina scanner as well. Now, we also have other types too. Now, they just generically call out electronic locks. I'm going to go a little bit farther than that because there are several different types of electronic locks. And we use, I want to say, Dan, if I'm not mistaken, I believe we use every single one of these types of locks within our building. All right, so the first one is really just a smart card. We also have pin entry where you have to type. You can see that one up there, as well as a key fob, which is a type of, that's something you have, if you will. It's not a card. Remember, it's got a little RF ID transmitter in it, and you touch it to the door and it opens up. So key fobs as well. But never overlook the simple fact, I think, Dan, you just mentioned it, the basic physical lock and key, right? And again, we use every one of these here at the IT Pro TV studio. So it is important to understand these. Now, Dan started out this episode with saying, hey, look, this little device, this is nice, and walk out with it, right? So there's also another type of lock, and maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you're not familiar with it, right? Cable locks, right? It's very easy to physically walk away with something like a mobile device, more specifically like a laptop. So they do make these locks that allow you to lock physically something like a mobile device, like a laptop, physically lock it down to your desk so somebody can't just come in and grab it and run out the front door.
Yeah, they can be very, very helpful. I've used them. I've seen them anywhere, and they can be a really good device just to keep things from going walkabouts and you having to, well, put in an asset loss. We don't want to see those, right? Money is money. We don't want to waste it. Let's move on to the idea of Barney Fife, getting him to, depending on your environment and your the sensitivity of your data, you might actually want to have a guard present or guards.
That's right.
Multiple guards to watch this. Tell us about using guards, Wes. What do we need to know about that?
Well, they kind of, they go hand in hand with things like security cameras, right? When we talk about something an alarm going off, right? That's where the guard comes in. The guard is there to respond to anything typically on site. We could have more than just guards, though. Remember, you usually have some kind of reception area, if you will, maybe a receptionist in there. Now, with the receptionist, I also want to keep in mind a concept that goes right along with physical security. And again, it's not really, under the form of reception, but it should be. And that's things like visitor logs, right? And things like access control rosters, right? We want to keep track of people that are coming into our building, right? And it is important to remember that we've talked about things like social engineering attacks that are impersonation, where maybe they're impersonating, some kind of IT repair company. Maybe, hey, we're coming in here and we're part of the HVAC or heating and ventilation and AC repair company. We need access into that closet. All right. Okay, you do? Well, I need your point of contact, and I need you to sign not only the visitor's log, but since you might be going into a secure area, the access control roster as well. Right? So it's basically about keeping track about who's coming in and who's going out of the building. Now, the next one I think is kind of interesting. They put it in there, and that's maybe it's the way of the future, and that's robot sentries. I just went ahead and put in here something like iRobot.
Yeah, nothing like getting your arms ripped off by a giant mechanical man.
That's right. So the level and extent at which you see that's only going to increase as we move into the future. These could be little autonomous machines. That the only thing I can think of is these little autonomous machines that we've seen in Star Wars, right, rolling around. Now, at this point, I don't know that the
I'm thinking
Roombas.
Terminator. Our brains do two different things, right?
That's right. Skynet becomes self-aware, that's for sure. So they put that in there too. I'd say the final thing that we think about personnel is really about this whole concept of separation of duties. And the one thing that I can think of more than anything is that we've got not just one key, we've got two keys, right? Any kind of very important, highly secure area that maybe you want not just one person literally to have the keys to the kingdom, but you want to separate that. So you might hear this whole term of two-person control. It's just a fancy way to say, hey, we need separation of duties. We don't just want one person having, all of the power. We want to kind of separate that up between two responsible individuals that we trust within our company.
All right, now we've got all this put together. We have a lot of great physical security controls, but you also have to know where needs the control, where are the areas that need to be secured? What is that? There's a couple of ways in which that could work itself out, depending, again, on your environment. Wes, you're going to take us through a few of them just so we can be familiar.
Yeah, Nan. So on the in the objectives, they talk about a few different types of secure areas that they want you to be aware of, and one of the first ones is what we call air gap networks and air gap systems. And you've heard us already mention these really throughout this series, right? We talk about things like SCADA systems and industrial control systems. Now, in the earlier days, a lot of times those types of networks were not even connected to TCP/IP-based networks. That's definitely changed, and we've got somebody decided that it would be a good thing to actually attach those to networks. So when we talk about an air gap system, just think about, or network, if you will, just think about a network and think about your network communications, whether it's the routing in and out of that network, whether it's the physical cables connected, or maybe a wireless communication, and we don't want any of that. When it comes to bringing information in and out of that network, well, we're going to just lend ourselves to the old prior networking days, the good old sneaker net, right, where you're not going to actually have these systems connected to any network. So, for instance, I believe the highest level of our time servers out there, I don't even believe they're connected to any direct networks, right? They have to make physical serial-based connections into them to communicate with them. Now, you might say, well, wait a second, I connect to time servers all the time. Those are lower level time servers that you connect to, but I don't think, if you look at things like Space Observatory, it's even connected to any kind of network. So just think about critical systems like that you do not want to have access to the network. That's why they call them air gap. There is no direct network connection to them. The other thing as well, we have things like vaults and safes. They're exactly what they sound like. There's nothing really special about those. And again, it's part of physical security, right? Maybe you have things like, for instance, your critical backups, right? We've talked about on-site, off-site backups. Well, your on-site backups, a lot of times, are data that you need access to right away. Off-site backups sometimes are a little bit farther back in your point of time, if you will. So we definitely can have things like vaults and safes. And then finally, I want to mention this other one that when they talk about secure areas, they put this term hot aisle, cold aisle in here. And really what that is, I got a good little diagram that I found that kind of shows what this does. It's a strategic, basically like a HVAC system that moves hot air and cold air strategically to help cool your data center. A lot of times what you'll see down here at the bottom is a raised floor, and you'll see there that term crack, I think it's great. It's the computer room air conditioning system. It's basically the device that maintains, monitors the temperature, the air distribution. Remember, we talked about moisture, humidity, if you will. All of that's going to be built into that system. And that's what hot aisle, cold aisle is. Again, it's just a strategically placed climate control system that moves the hot air and the cold air and circulates it so that your data centers aren't overheating. It's not the only thing that's in those data centers, but it is one of the major parts of cooling within a larger type data center like that.
Well, Wes, that is an amazing slide, and I learned a lot from it. I'm going to go ahead and just throw that out there for you. Really enjoyed this episode. Hopefully you did as well. We saw a lot of really great physical secure controls that we can implement to keep our sites on lockdown, and that's what we're looking for, and some good information for us for the Security Plus exam. Being said, we're out of time for this episode, but we have more to come in this series. So as always, we look forward to seeing you there. Until then, have yourself a great day.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.